Hey, what is up, everybody? Platform Disciple here, continuing our Rebellion full set review. And before we begin, I want to let everyone know, in case they didn't already know, that there is a pretty sweet DLC on sale in the Steam store, which is this Rebellion Designer Deck bundle. It comes with quite a bit of LP, and also the decks are actually very, very saturated with high rarity cards, including a bunch of legends, which is very, very good for newer players or players who just simply haven't collected those legends. So I seriously recommend you check it out. It also comes with an alt art Spirit of Vengeance, which, like, I don't know how they picked that card. I really don't care for it very much, but we'll get to it when we are doing our review, and we're going to start that right now. So start off, and we're skipping Strength of Unity because we did it in the Flamed On video, but to start off, we're doing Daude's Honor Guard, which I think is probably very strong in Rift Run and has potential in Constructed, particularly in the command zone, because in the command zone you can put him straight into the defense zone, which is pretty good. But some notable things are that against Flamed On he is practically unkillable, and he's also very good, I think, against the Tibat style decks because the damage can still be targeted onto him, but he just won't take it. And he also synergizes, but also counters. But more importantly, I think, is the synergizing, is that he synergizes very well with Yuan-Shi and Yuan-Shi's Wrath, because those cards will not actually damage him. And that clearly has a lot of merit in the command zone, I think. Moving on, Defiant Monk, I've already talked about, but it already, I think, definitely has a very good place in the game, in the Jinhai Dojo decks, particularly the ones that use sleepers to combo Fear and Jinhai Dojo together. I'm using 3 in mine because he is low cost, has decent stats, and giving your characters more health in the defense zone helps with the overall strategy, so I think he's very good. Host to the Ancestors, I've already talked about, and my opinion of him hasn't changed much, which is that I think he has some potential, especially in Rift Run, but he might just be too slow for Constructed. And Descendants of Dragons is already a faction that tends to win if the game gets very slow. So I don't know if it necessarily needs Host to the Ancestors, really. Okay, next up, Jade Witch. And this is a card that I definitely expect to see Constructed play because, first of all, unlike the other hybrid faction cards in this set, Jade Witch, I think Veror and Descendants of the Dragons actually go very, very well together. And this is a very desirable effect, and it has good stats too. So being able to kill a minion and get an 8/12 is super awesome. So I think if we see Descendants of the Dragons Veror decks, I think that this is definitely a card that we can expect to see in them. Okay, next up, Spirit Guard, another one we've already seen before, and my opinion of him is as before, which is that compared to Agent Coil Immovable, in most cases they exchange with similar numbers of minions, but Agent Coil Immovable, in addition to having the ability to fall back on the dragon, and sometimes the relevant can't take more than 5 damage from a source, you don't have to overcharge to get Agent Coil to work, but the one thing I will say is that Spirit Guard is a common, so if you do not have Agent Coil Immovable, it could be a potential card to run instead until you get Agent Coil Immovable, and he's also definitely a card that I think has a lot of potential in Rift Run for the very powerful stats. Okay, next up, Spirit Guide. This card has good stats for its cost, and the effect is very, very nice, especially against something like Sleepers, or really any deck that focuses on reanimating or recycling. I just don't know what deck uses this card, because it's definitely a very good card, but it's not as strong graveyard hate as something like Grave Rob is, And so I don't know if it's a good sideboard card or not. Give me a minute. I know you all know what Grave Rob is at this point, but we still have to look it up just in case. Grave Rob. But that being said, I think Spirit Guide is a pretty solid card. It's just the trick is finding when is the time to use it, what deck to use it in. Okay, and now we can talk about Spirit of Vengeance, which is the alt art card in the DLC bundle that is on sale. And I think that my main beef with the card is, first of all, that it's 2 Descendants of the Dragon's Purity, which takes out the main synergy that I want to use the card for, which is to play Mass Death in your own deck with that. And then you have a 10/10 flyer that lives through the Mass Death, which is definitely very sweet. Having anything that lives through Mass Death at 1 purity is pretty nice to combo with it. But because it's 2 purity, it's very difficult to actually destroy it yourself without doing something like wasting a Death Ray. The one thing I will say that works pretty well is something like Ashes to Ashes and Dust to Dust are 1 purity. And because they give you a copy of the card in return, it's very easy to use Ashes to Ashes and Dust to Dust on Spirit of Vengeance without having to worry too much about losing value. But it's very slow to give him +5/+5, I think. So I'm not sure. And the other main problem I have with the card is that as of now, I do not think that Veror, which is the primary faction that is going to be able to hurt Spirit of Vengeance, I don't think Veror is really that much of a threat to 2 DoD or higher, 2 Descendants of the Dragon's Purity or higher decks, because the longer the game goes on, the more chance I think most Descendants of the Dragon's decks have of winning, and Veror tends to be pretty slow. It could be a good sideboard against Veror, so we'll have to wait and see. But as of now, I have mixed feelings about the card, and until I see someone use the card very well, I don't have high expectations for it. All right, we've already talked about the Impervious in the past, but he's very good. He completely shuts down attackers. And in a very desperate situation when he's indestructible, it's even better. I think this card's definitely very playable. Any deck that wants to stall should consider using this card. I think it's got a lot of potential. Okay, next up, Z, Martyr of Peace, and this is the Descendants of the Dragons version of the Martyr card. We've already talked about it, and my opinion of it has changed somewhat since seeing the other Martyr cards, and I feel compared to the other Martyr cards, its effect is quite underwhelming, because I think that the other Martyr cards have a very, very clear path to winning the game after getting them out and using their effect, whereas Z, Martyr of Peace is kind of like a glorified Calamity. I guess the main upside is that it only hits your opponent's stuff, and you can also follow it up with a Yuan-Shi's Wrath and or Lin Bao's Will. Just quickly looking those up. Hit for 4, and Lin Bao's Will, if you use it before, is going to hurt their morale a lot if they have a lot of characters out. But I don't know. I haven't seen this card played very much yet compared to the other Martyrs, which I've seen much more of, and I don't know if it's worth using, because like I said, Descendants of the Dragons, if the game goes on for a long time, they're already in a good state, and this card doesn't really do much for them once they've already, like, if you hit turn 10 on Descendants of the Dragons, you're already pretty well off. So I'm not sure. We'll have to wait and see, but as of now, I think it's definitely very weak compared to the other Martyr cards. Okay, next up, and I need to talk about Pacify and Spiritualize at the same time. Spiritualize is 2 purity, Pacify is 1. But both of them are 3-cost removals that hit the battlefield. So they at least for decks that have the option to run both, compete with each other a lot. I think both of them are good, and they're better in some cases than each other. I think that Pacify, I mean, is noteworthy because 1 Purity makes it very easy to put into a deck. Spiritualize, however, compared to Pacify, can get rid of characters that have very, very, very powerful abilities, whereas Pacify is going to be primarily used to take care of a very large attacker. I think both of the cards are good, but it feels a little awkward when you're at 2 DoD or above, because I don't think you can really justify using that many 3-cost removal spells, but who knows? If somebody ends up running 6 of them, and they can prove me wrong. Okay, Second Wind, and this card I think is very, very strong and has a lot of potential for, I mean, first of all, I think it's just decent on its as a standalone card, but again, in certain decks, you might be able to take advantage of the fact even more, by having a specific character that you want to boost the hell out of. So I like it a lot. An extra life is just a very powerful effect, and especially for Descendants of the Dragons, which can increase the health of a character, and when the health is increased, the second life of that character does remember how much you've increased the health, which is a very big deal. So I like this card a lot, and 1 Purity gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of what you want to do with the card. Okay, last 2. Peaceful Garden, and I think this location is extremely, extremely good. The slower the deck, the better Peaceful Garden is going to get, because all characters do 2 less damage, is so strong against very fast decks. If they're playing lots of little characters, it completely wrecks them. I think the card's very good. I've been using it, and it's 1 Purity as well, so once again gives you a lot of options for how you want to play the card and what deck's going to use it. The stallier the deck, the better this card gets. And last up, Shun Howl's Urn. This is an interesting one because some people look at the card and think aggro, because clearly if Flame Dawn had access to this card, this would be a very, very easy way for Flame Dawn to just close the game up once they've got someone down pretty low. But for Descendants of the Dragons, it's a win condition for a deck that wants to stall, where you put it out and then you continue to do what you're doing, where you're just stalling. And I like that a lot. The card, at a bare minimum, presents a sideboard option for Descendants of the Dragons when playing against other control decks. But in addition to that, I think it opens up a few options for decks built around Shun Howl's Urn as the primary win condition. But we'll have to wait and see. And before we finish up this video, I want to say that Descendants of the Dragons was a faction that a lot of people were kind of losing their minds, at least in the chat, about like the strength of their cards relative to some of the other factions. People felt that these cards were not strong enough to put Descendants of the Dragons back on the map competitively. And my answer to that is, first of all, I think all the cards are very, very powerful. Well, actually, not all of them, but some of them are very, very powerful. But the problem that I think people see and feel is that the cards that are very powerful from this new set don't do anything to help triple DoD very much. I mean, like, I'm not saying you wouldn't use these cards, but it doesn't patch up any of the current weaknesses of triple Descendants of the Dragons. And in addition to that, you got to understand that Descendants of the Dragons has extremely limited options in terms of what you can do with it early on in the game. And just to show you, if the cost is less than 3, Descendants of the Dragons, ooh, I did something wrong. Oh, there we go. The cards that cost less than 3, a lot of them are reactive cards, like, for example, Disarm and Humble, Lin-Bao's Will, things like that, Vigil, cards that don't become relevant until later in the game. And from the new set, we didn't see anything that changed that. As for the early characters, although there are early characters that you can play that have decent stats, the problem is that Descendants of the Dragons just doesn't have much to do with them relative to other factions. And I think if Descendants of the Dragons had a very powerful 1 or 2 drop in the new set, people would feel very differently about it. The other thing that I need to say about that is that, like, you might be asking yourself, why can Flame Dawn get all these hyper aggressive charge low cost characters if Descendants of the Dragons can't get a very powerful low cost vigilance character? And I think the reason is that although charge does a much better job of bringing the game to a close, vigilance has the potential to get you way higher card value by trading 1 or 2 for 1 or 3 for 1 with your opponent. And if you had a powerful early game vigilance character, like Invisible the Defender is not nearly as powerful or as aggressively statted as like the Flame Dawn cards. If this card was like a 6/7 with vigilance, like, holy moly, it would it would trade at least 2 for 1 against Flame Dawn like 90% of the time, which is part of the reason why I think we don't see that many high statted defensive cards for Descendants of the Dragons at lower purity. The last thing I want to say about people complaining about the strength of Descendants of the Dragons in this new set is that unlike a lot of the other factions where going triple purity is sometimes very easy, Descendants of the Dragons, the new cards are very strong, but for splashed decks where you're using only 1 or 2 purity of Descendants of the Dragons, and that's worth thinking about. Whereas I think a lot of the new cards for the other factions very clearly fit into pre-existing triple purity archetypes. So I think that a lot of the powerful DoD cards are ones that we're going to see when people build new decks with different purities around them, rather than, like, for example, if you go to the Genesis cards, Little Timmy Bot, Splitter Light, Placebotron, Biginator. These are cards that all fit into triple purity pre-existing decks that were very obvious. For Veror, you have Acquire, you have Ashes to Ashes, you have Martyr of Death, you have Malignant. All very clearly could be triple purity. Warpath, Helix Worm, Dragon of the Autumn Wind. I think you guys are getting the point. Whereas if you go to DoD, there's nothing that screams like, I need to put this in my triple DoD deck. But there are definitely cards in here that I think scream like this could be a card that opens the door for new very powerful decks that we have to experiment with a little more. Anyways, that is my thoughts on all the DoD cards, and in the next video we're going to be covering the single one solitary sleepers card and the exiles cards. See you then.